Welcome to the Texas Conflict Coach radio program. If you've ever experienced or engaged in destructive or unresolved conflict, then you know it leads to broken relationships, distrust, and damaging results. Our program will help you manage and resolve conflict effectively with strategies, valuable resources, and support. Since 2009, our radio program hosted guest experts from around the globe sharing their perspectives, experiences, and expertise while giving you food for thought. If you can't listen live, then download and listen to any of our 300-plus podcasts in our library at texasconflictcoach.com. So sit back, relax, or join the conversation every Tuesday evening, or tweet us at TXConflictCoach.
Good evening, listeners. We continue our series on cultural conflict. With me tonight is Nina Meierding in our episode, Conflict and Miscommunication Across Cultures. Practical skills for creating better understanding and better relationships. Now, Nina has worked with many cultures in her decades of mediation work, and she's going to share with us concepts such as the different ways of looking at fairness, how cultures respond to conflict and why they have dissimilar desires as to their goals and outcomes, but also how people express the same emotion in a variety of ways and why it is a common mistake to pretend, if you will, to be in someone else's shoes. Now, Nina will share very practical strategies tonight to help you understand some of the diversity across cultures that can create problems and explore positive steps in working through this conflict. Now, who is Nina? Nina Meierding, and that's spelled M-E-I-E-R-D-I-N-G. She has assisted in the resolution of thousands of disputes and has conducted training throughout the world, including Canada, Sweden, Ireland, England, Scotland, the Netherlands, New Zealand, and India. She has been an adjunct professor at Pepperdine University School of Law in Malibu, California for almost 25 years, as well as Southern Methodist University's dispute resolution program for almost 20 years. For many years of service and expertise, Nina was awarded the Peacemaker Award in 1992 by the Southern California Mediation Association for her outstanding work in the conflict resolution field, and in 2005 she was awarded the John Haynes Distinguished Mediator Award, which is an international award given annually by the Association for Conflict Resolution. In addition to her teaching and training, Nina is a mediation consultant and mediation partner for the Wisconsin Special Education Mediation System. And I feel so blessed to have Nina as part of our program series. I've actually been in Nina's sessions at our conferences and have met her once before at the Association for Conflict Resolution annual conference, and I'm really honored to have you here, Nina, tonight. So thank you and welcome tonight to our show.
Well, thank you. I'm honored to be here. I think this is a wonderful service you provide.
Well, thank you, and that's what we're trying to do is educate the public, about where conflict comes into play. So let folks know that although you can certainly call in live, and that's a way to listen in. You can join us in the chat room. We have a number of guests who've already logged in there, so welcome guests to the chat room. Please leave your comments and questions there. I'll bring them into the program with Nina. And we're also using our Twitter feed. We have our graduate intern from University of Baltimore tweeting for us tonight, and you can use the hashtag TCC Radio, and that is another way that we will see your comments and questions. So our program is a little bit longer tonight, listeners, than we normally have because we have a lot of great information to share with you and some strategies. So we will be going close to 45 minutes outside of our 30-minute norm, and so I'm really honored that Nina could extend her time today to do that. So, Nina, let's get right into your own quest. You have taken this journey to studying and teaching others about culture and conflict, and this is obviously one of your very passionate areas. So say more about that, why it's important to you.
It has always been important to me, I think, as long as I can remember, understanding why people do things and how we miscommunicate. And I think oftentimes we think that people intentionally miscommunicate, and I think a lot of the errors that we make are improper or inappropriate assumptions about what people are doing and what their motivations are. My background prior to being a professor and a trainer, I was a special ed teacher. I worked with a lot of parents from different cultures. I was a lawyer. I saw how conflict was different across cultures and across genders. I became a mediator for 25 years, and that was a perfect laboratory, if you will, to see how miscommunication can happen and conflict can increase simply because of misunderstandings that have made the conflict worse. And so it's always been a passion of mine to do a lot of reading, to do a lot of listening, to do a lot of exploration in this field.
Well, wonderful. And listeners will obviously hear that passion as she talks about the various things. And so one of the things about when we think about resolving conflict, we recognize, I think all of us recognize that there are different cultures, but what we don't think about is that these cultures have different goals or different ways in which they manage and resolve conflict. So say more about your understanding through your research and experience about this.
Well, one of the first things I want to make sure that we really also keep in mind is a wonderful quote, which is, "We are all like all others, we are all like some others, and we are all like no others," which was a quote by Clark Hone. And it's a comment that I always have to bring myself back to, because when we talk about culture and we talk about cultural tendencies or cultural prototypes, we have to make sure that we don't create a stereotype, which is, okay, if you're dealing with someone from XYZ country, this is how they're going to behave. And once we make that kind of stereotype, we're lost, because we lose curiosity, we lose our sense of each person as their own individual. So when we talk tonight about how different cultures look at conflict, or how they process information, or how they look at fairness, it's important to realize that there's enough research to know that there might be a cultural tendency within a particular country or community, but that doesn't mean that everybody is going to be able is going to respond that way. So, for example, when we look at goals and trying to resolve conflict, there are cultures that are more collective and tend to, therefore, be group-focused, and their goal oftentimes in conflict is to seek harmony again, to say, how can we heal from this problem? How do we reunite? How do we come back as a community? How do we help people save space in this conflict so that they don't lose their place within our culture and lose their place within who they are in relationship to the group? And so the focus is much more on trying to preserve a relationship, not just the relationship of two individuals, but to preserve a relationship within the culture as a whole. Other cultures, generally more Western cultures, tend to have a more problem-solving mode. So it's, okay, we have a conflict, so let's get the information, let's get a deal, let's resolve what our issues are, who gets what, who's right, who's wrong, and then let's move forward. And that doesn't mean that the relationship is not important to people from Western cultures, but oftentimes people from Western cultures tend to be more issue-focused and deal-focused as far as, okay, here's the problem, how are we going to fix it? What I find fascinating about this is there's also a gender component to it, and there's been wonderful research by Deborah Tannen, she's spelled Tannen on this, and she talks about the difference between rapport, R-A-P-P-O-R-T, and report, R-E-P-O-R-t, culture, as far as from the gender perspective. And the person who's using rapport, R-A-P-P-O-R-T, is saying, I'm having a conversation with you, so we're having a conversation. And the fact that we're talking together, the fact that we're relating, the fact that we're connecting is the goal of the conversation. I don't need you to do anything. I don't need you to give me advice. I just want to have this time together. Versus report talk, which is, okay, now I want to have a conversation because we need to get something resolved. We need to try to take care of this. So that would be like the two differences there.
And so as to not stereotype, I would imagine that the tendency would be that women were rapport and the men were more report.
In Western cultures, in general, yes. Yes.
In Western cultures.
Yeah, because oftentimes within an Eastern culture where we're looking at, okay, how do we maintain harmony, then there's a pretty high use of R-A-P-P-O-R-T, the rapport kind of conversation, because it's not just about fixing the problem. It's about, even before we start to try to fix the problem, we'll spend more time creating a relationship in order to be able to talk in a way that's different than if we just say, okay, let's get down to business. what information do you have, what information do I have. So I think there's both a gender and a cultural component in that kind of speech, although Tan's work is very specific to gender.
To gender. And so we're going to look at some various fundamental differences in the various cultures, but before we do that, we have a number of people who've joined us in the studio and also in the chat room. So again, if you're in the chat room, welcome, and if you have comments or questions you want me to bring into the program, please type them into the chat box. I'll be more than happy to do that. And we won't be taking live callers' comments or questions, but thank you for joining us in the studio tonight. So let's move on to the next element, which there are a number of concepts that you are wanting to talk about that are very fundamental in how people relate to conflict, especially at different cultures. And so let's chat about the first concept of fairness and then specific strategies for resolving differences around fairness. And we'll go through a number of these types of constructs. So why don't we begin there?
Okay. It's always interesting when people would come into mediation and they would say something like, I'm really frustrated. I hate the other side. I don't know how we're going to resolve this. I don't trust them. And they were very upset. I always thought, okay, that's pretty straightforward. It's not going to be, I can work with this. When I would hear people come in and they would be very, very calm and they would say, Nina, this shouldn't be too difficult because after all I want is what's fair. I was thinking, now we're in trouble. Now we're in trouble. Because for them, fairness is defined by what they believe fairness to be. But fairness for someone else may have not just a different outcome that they think is fair, but a different way of looking at fairness from a very fundamental level. So there's basically several ways that people look at fairness. One is sort of through the legal construct, and that's not just saying things like what the law is or what a statute is or what a judge would tell you, but it's sort of using any objective criteria. So in the workplace, for example, when you have employee handbooks about how you're supposed to behave in the workplace, that would be a legal standard of fairness. So it's what we think of as objective criteria, usually universally applied, that we say, okay, this is what we're supposed to do to be what's fair. And so a lot of Western cultures are very comfortable with this. In fact, most cultures that have a very strong legal system to resolve their conflicts will say, well, the legal construct of fairness is obviously very, very important, and it is. But it's just one of several. So another one is the equitable construct, which is saying things like, well, I know what the law would say, or I know what that paper says we should do, but, shouldn't we really look at something more equitable based on what we did and how much money we each invested and how much time we devoted to this? And so it may be that the law might say that, let's say, Patty, you and I decided we're going to do a project and we're going to get paid for it, and someone says, okay, we'll give you $10,000 to do it. And you and I have an agreement, and the agreement is that we'll each split that 50-50. But then let's say that I get sick and I can't do any of the work, and you do all the work. And so at the end, we get this check for $10,000, and we have a little written agreement that says you get 50% of that, and I get 50% of that. And I could say, well, Patty, look, this says I should get, $5,000. I should get half of this. And you might say, okay, or you might say, well, Nina, I did 90% of the work on this, and it just doesn't feel fair to me that you would get exactly what I would get. So that's an equitable standard of fairness. And this one, again, Western cultures seem to be pretty good at understanding. Okay. The third one is needs-based. And this is what you see in a lot of collective cultures, which is it doesn't matter who makes the money. It doesn't matter who did what. It doesn't matter what the law is. It's who needs it. That we take care of our own, we leave no one behind. And so if you and I had that same contract and we were making $10,000, but someone else within our culture needed it, you and I would look at each other, not out of obligation, not out of, maybe we should do this, and not out of charity, but we would say, this person's having a tough time. Let's give them $3,000 of it, or $4,000. And we would almost put the needs of the other greater than the needs for ourselves, because we're part of a group and we keep the group. So we do it based on needs. And then there's the faith-based standard of fairness, which is what would my God, whoever my God is, in whatever cultural construct and whatever faith, what would my God say is fair? And so when people say, I just want what's fair, I have no idea what their fairness perception comes from. And one of the things that I always tell people who are trying to resolve conflicts when fairness is an issue, and it's a very practical step, it's actually really simple, is that oftentimes mediators or facilitators will say things to parties like, well, you know, if you guys can't resolve this, then the court or an arbitrator or a board or whatever, then they will decide what's fair. And that seems like a really automatic thing to say, but it really distances the person who just said that from the people who are in conflict, because they're going to be thinking, well, no, that's not fair. That's not fair. How can you say that that's fair? You're saying that the court can tell me what's fair, but I don't think the court is fair, because that's not their system of fairness. So I just tweaked what I say to people, and I say, you know, you've asked me here to help you resolve this conflict, and it's getting tough to do that. And I know you want what's fair, and I know that you want what's fair. And it must be also very frustrating for you to know that if you don't resolve this conflict, a different standard of fairness than the one that you want to use will be used if you go to court, because the court is going to use a legal standard of fairness. They don't have flexibility to deviate from that. And I know that that's hard, but that's the reality. So if you want to try to resolve this together, using whatever standards of fairness you're comfortable using and you can still resolve it, then you can do that. And in that way, it's respecting that they have different standards of fairness. It's not picking a right one or a wrong one, but it's also reality testing them and saying, you know what, I know you want your faith-based standard of fairness or your needs-based standard of fairness or whatever the standard is other than the law to be used, but the reality is if you go to that other forum, it won't be used. And then people, I think, listen better than simply saying, well, if you go to court, the court will tell you what's fair, where they're resisting that concept from the beginning.
You know, I like the conversation here in the sense that, one, your own strategy when you are in a position of intervening and working as a mediator, as a conflict problem solver, peace builder, people all call themselves different things, is really honoring what that definition, that experience, that belief is for them about what fairness means to them. I mean, it's a typical thing when it says, well, I want to be treated with professionalism and respect. Well, what does that mean? And what I like about, what does it mean? What does it look like? And to, like you said, to honor and empower them and not only their decisions, but their own perspectives of how they see fairness. And so my question then is, I know you gave a strategy, especially as if we were an intervener or a mediator, but if we are dealing with our own conflict, neighbor to neighbor, or, you know, boss to employee, something of that nature, what is the strategy you would recommend if they didn't have a third-party intervener to address this difference of fairness?
I think when part of this will depend if you come from a more direct or an indirect culture, which we'll talk about in a little while. But for me, it's identifying it, to have an awareness of it. I think when we feel something is fair and we see it from our perspective, we really just want to convince the other person that we're right, that our fairness standard is the right one to use and that theirs is wrong. And that'll just increase the conflict. As mediators, as conflict resolvers, we know, and it's hard for us when it's one-on-one and in our own conflict versus when we're helping somebody else. But I think the piece of it is that people can agree to a resolution, the same resolution, using different standards of fairness. So if you and I are neighbors, and I'm thinking to myself, you know what? I don't have the time and the energy to invest all the money going to court to fight this issue we have about your rose bushes on my lawn or something, or your dog barking in the middle of the night. You know what? And I'm just going to resolve it by looking at presenting you with here's what you're allowed to do under the homeowner's rules, and that's going to be my approach. And you're saying, well, you know what, I don't like the law. I think the law was wrong in the first place. And I have to tell you that I need my dog, and my dog barks because the dog protects me. And so, therefore, my standard of fairness is what I need and not what the law is. And so now we have two conflicting standards of fairness. And rather than say yours is wrong or yours is wrong, say, okay, is there a way understanding that we see this problem differently and we see fairness differently, is there still a way that we can come up with a solution that works for both of us? Can we work together knowing that it will be with different perspectives and different backgrounds to still come up with a solution? Because I think where a lot of conflict happens is beating each other over the head with it, mine is right, no, mine is right, no, mine is right. You have to do it my way. You have to do it my way, rather than saying we can both agree to an outcome for two very, very different reasons. It might be that we eventually agree because I say, you know what, I also believe in a standard of fairness of my faith, which says I need to forgive, and you truly seem sorry to me for the noise that your dog has created, and it has been annoying, but I need to forgive you as long as you're able to proactively move forward and do something constructive about it. And then I'm using a different standard of fairness even then. So, again, having that flexibility and that understanding, I think, is key.
Well, very, very good. So, we're going to go to the next construct, and the biggest thing I take away from that is never make assumptions about what fairness means to the other person, and even thinking clearly for myself, if I'm in conflict, what is my own belief about fairness? And so being, like you said, being curious and asking questions to really raise that level of either self-awareness or awareness of the other individual that you might be talking with. But I love the strategy you had about, especially if you're a mediator, I love that strategy about looking at the different standards of fairness, and that could be, somebody else could be imposing a different standard of fairness, for example, as a court. So that was that really stands out for me about that. Before we go to the next concept, is there anything else you wanted to say about fairness?
I think the last thing is that we need to sort of be humble about it, because when we get on, as my grandmother used to say, our high horse and say that we're the one that's being fair, we change, I think, as individuals, our standard of fairness. I mean, we may be using a different standard of fairness if the law is the better standard of fairness and the more convenient one for us to use. Or we might look at an equitable standard of fairness if we say, hey, we're two business people. Let's figure this out a different way. We want to have a long-term relationship. We may use a needs-based standard of fairness when we're working with our families. We may use a faith-based standard of fairness when we're looking at forgiveness. So even internally, we use different standards of fairness. And so for us to pretend in an argument with someone else that there's only one way and it's my way of looking at it, we're not even acknowledging to ourselves, hey, wait a minute, I sometimes use different standards of fairness depending on the situation I'm in. So lighten up, Nina. Be more open-minded and see if I can get their perspective a little bit better.
Okay, excellent. All right, let's talk about another difference, another concept, and that is between high and low uncertainty avoidance. So first, why don't you say exactly what you mean by uncertainty avoidance?
Okay, this is a concept I wish I've known about it for about 20 years, and if I knew about it in the first 30 or 40 years of my life, I think I would have been a much better negotiator and conflict resolver and probably a better person all around. This is a concept that Geert Hofstede, Hofstede, and he's one of the resources that's listed on the books that I recommended. He talked about from the perspective of uncertainty avoidance. So if we break it down, avoidance means I don't want to deal with something. Uncertainty avoidance means I don't want to deal with uncertainty. I don't like the subjective feeling of not knowing what's going to happen. I don't like this subjective feeling of not having something planned or not knowing all the contingencies. So someone who has high uncertainty avoidance really, really doesn't like that feeling. Someone who has low uncertainty avoidance is like, well, to quote John Lennon, life is what happens when you're busy making other plans, and we can plan all we want to, but things are going to happen, and part of us is to be able to deal with things as they come up, not that we're going to try to remove all uncertainty. Now, where there's confusion around this is some people say, oh, that's like risk, so if we just analyze risk with people, then they'll be okay, and uncertainty avoidance is different than that. Uncertainty avoidance is a subjective feeling. Risk you can analyze. Risk you can say, okay, if you went to court, how many times out of 10 do you think you'll win? If you say this to the other person, what are the odds that they'll walk out of the room? If I present my argument this way, what are the odds that they'll agree with me? Okay, that's risk analysis. But uncertainty avoidance is the feeling of uncertainty. And so what happens is you have people in your life who have high uncertainty avoidance, and you have people in your life who have low uncertainty avoidance. And that in itself isn't where the conflict is generated. It's when the person who has high uncertainty avoidance, who needs that planning, who needs to talk about every single contingency, well, what about this? What about this? What about that? Runs up against the person with low uncertainty avoidance, who then hears this person saying, well, what about this? Or what if you don't follow through? Or I don't think we've talked about this enough. And instead of knowing that the other person is high uncertainty avoidant, oftentimes the low uncertainty avoidant person, the person who doesn't need all that detail, thinks that the other person, the person with high uncertainty avoidance, they think, oh, they don't trust me. And they make it personal to them. They say, this person does not trust me, and so they reject the other person, or they get angry, or they say, what did I ever do to make you feel like this? Not understanding that a high uncertain avoidant person, that's their worldview. They're going to feel that way about this particular negotiation or communication with me, but they're also going to feel that way when they take a trip and they want to get to the airport 3 hours earlier for a domestic flight, and they want to have, backup agreements for things. And that's just how they look at uncertainty. It's how many holes can I plug and how many contingencies can I talk about. And so one of the big takeaways for me here was to really think about, if I'm in conflict with somebody, whether it's across cultures or just in gender, and they're wanting, or just in general, I want to know, are they asking for all this detail because it's a trust issue with me, in which case I know that I need to work on trust with them? Or is it because they are high uncertainty avoidant, which means that it isn't about me, it isn't about trusting me, it's simply that they need the detail. They need to remove that uncertainty that makes them feel uncomfortable. And so that was a huge takeaway for me in helping other people understand conflict as well. Because when I first started out as a mediator, I was trained a lot in how to work with people who are distrustful of each other. And there are certainly situations, many, many situations, where trust is a huge factor. But I hadn't really identified the difference between high uncertainty avoidance and what we call situational distrust, meaning you don't trust me, rather than the need for clarity and specificity and getting everything nailed down. So that was a huge one for me.
Yes, that is actually, and I'm glad you have that resource, which is on the program page at Texas Conflict Coach under Nina's program page, the author. One of the things that's coming up for me right now is, how does this particular concept tie into various cultures? Is it tied to a particular one of the collective cultures, or is this tied to gender differences? Can you tie that for us?
It's not so much gender differences. There's actually an interesting correlation, and I don't know which came first, the chicken or the egg with this one, but cultures that have Catholicism as their strong religious base, or Greek Orthodoxy, tend to also be cultures that are high uncertainty avoidance. So the cultures where there's a very strong Catholic core in that culture tend to be more high uncertainty avoidant. You also can see high uncertainty avoidance in what we call corporate culture, which is a whole different area than, culture by country or ethnicity. And you can have some corporate cultures that in and of themselves are very high uncertainty avoidant, and others that are lower uncertainty avoidant. You can have certain professions. So, for example, the law, we're trained as lawyers to be high uncertainty avoidant, to fix every hole, to make sure we've talked about every contingency, to make sure that our contracts go on 97 bazillion pages. Mm-hmm. So we've been trained. See, culture is learned. Culture, you're not born with these attributes that we're talking about. This is learned behavior. So it's not part of your personality, your innateness. It's stuff that you have learned by being around who you're around. And so that's a huge piece for me, is that there's people who come from a particular culture, then that culture may be a high uncertainty avoidant culture, but they are now more low uncertainty avoidant, maybe because of the company or the corporation they worked in, and they start to acclimate to it and they like that approach. Let's see how many inventions we can do. Let's see how many font styles we can develop. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't matter. And all of a sudden, you have somebody who's transitioning and beginning to adapt to other cultural components.
One thing that just, for listeners who this might be a new area for them is that when we talk about the word culture, we're not just talking about, people from different countries or different faiths or religions, etc. But it could be, like you said, it could be a corporate culture. It could be a profession, the culture of a particular profession. So it sounds like in the context of the various differences that we're dealing with, we're talking cultural in a very broad-based way here.
Yes, and I think there's some controversy in the field in how we do that. I mean, some people feel that when we talk about culture, it needs to be quite defined and much more narrow to ethnicity and race. Other people go the whole other direction and say, well, my family culture, my corporate culture, my neighborhood culture, and the business culture. And so you have a whole continuum of people along the spectrum of how they define culture. And that's, again, just even the very term of what we're talking about, what does culture mean, is different for people. Yeah.
Exactly. Okay, very good. Well, and I wanted to bring that to light, that we're not making an assumption that this is just limited to a specific country or something. Okay, very good. So we're at the halfway point, and you are listening to the Texas Conflict Coach Blog Talk Radio program. And Nina Meierding has joined me, and we're speaking about culture and conflict. And she's already been sharing not only some great concepts where there are major differences, but strategies around that. Is there any additional strategies you wanted to talk about with uncertainty avoidance before we go to the next construct?
I think with the high uncertainty avoidance and low uncertainty avoidance, part of it is finding out where that's coming from somebody. So, for example, if someone needs a lot of detail, I want to know, do you normally like to have a lot of details in your agreement? If someone wants to really plan something, is this something that you normally do, or is this specific to me? Without getting personal or having them feel like I'm attacking how they're doing it. So part of it for me is really to identify. And if I'm working with other people and they're in conflict, if I'm working as, in the workplace dealing with two employees, and one seems to be needing this kind of certainty, I'll say to that person, talk to me about how you like to look at certainty. Is this something that's unique with this person that you're having the conflict with, or is this something in just how you are and how you like to resolve issues? Because that way, again, it clarifies. So part of it is clarification. The difficult part is it's really, really easy if somebody is a low uncertainty avoidant person, meaning that anything goes, let's just see what happens, to find out if it's trust issues. Because they'll say, you know what, Nina, I would not normally need all this detail, but this person embezzled from me. Or this person is always telling me they're going to do stuff and they never do it, and I want it in writing. Then it's really clear to see that it's a distrust issue rather than high uncertainty avoidance. But when somebody is already high uncertainty avoidance, so they need all that stuff, and then on top of that, they don't trust the person, that's a lot harder to figure out, because they'll say things like, I need a lot of detail. Well, that could be for either reason. That could be because they don't trust them, but it could also be because they're high uncertainty avoidant. Or, I need to talk about every single possible contingency. Okay, that could be either. So it takes a little bit more digging if somebody is high uncertainty avoidant to find out if there's also trust issues. And I think that's where there needs to be a little bit of time and not making assumptions right off the bat. Oh, this is what they are. This isn't about diagnosing people and saying, I've figured out who they are and what they are, so now I know how to deal with them. It's about, okay, here's some cultural things that could be happening. I need to be curious and figure out what's going on before I know how I'm going to deal with it.
Okay, very, very good. I'm going to share something personal here, which we have very organic conversations on the show, and as you were talking, I was thinking, over the years of being a mediator, 20 years now of being a mediator, I think that I've actually become higher uncertainty avoidance only because of all the mediations I've done where conflict comes into play. And so now when I'm dealing with, not necessarily, it could be potential conflict, I'm trying to prevent conflict, I then get very detailed and ask a lot of questions to make sure to reduce the uncertainty or miscommunication or misunderstanding or all of those things. So I was thinking about that. I was like, maybe I've become higher uncertainty avoidance because of mediating other people's cases. It's kind of interesting. I don't know if you've ever experienced that for yourself, but kind of interesting. So,
well, I think for me, it's a lot of realizing that no matter how I plan things, the test of how I'm going to do is how I react when uncertainty happens. And so in some areas of my life, I've become more high uncertainty avoidant, and in other cases, I'm just like, well, you know what? No matter how much I do, no matter how well I plan, something can happen that I have no control over, and I just have to learn how to deal with that. Yeah.
Well, this is a really nice tidbit because I'll have to go back and read. Tell us the author's last name again.
Hofstede, Hofstede, and others have written about it. But the fascinating thing about him, which I really, really like, is if you just Google his name. So you can read the book, but you can also Google his name. You can look up different cultures. He has other attributes besides high uncertainty avoidance. And so it can be masculine and feminine cultures. It can be a lot of different cultural attributes. And you can look up a culture and a country. You can compare two countries. You can see a grid of how he's ranked different countries. And I think that's terrific. And my only cautionary note is I can't tell you how many corporations have me come in and do cultural training, and they say, well, we're going to send a delegation to Japan or to Germany. So we need to know a script. And I'll go, okay, there ain't no script. There is no script. These are things for you to look for, to think about, to be curious about, but you can't assume because it's somebody on a grid, on a Hofstede grid, or in this particular book or whatever, that because a culture has a stronger sense of this does not mean that the individuals that you're going to be dealing with will have it.
Right. So it's making those assumptions again that we can just, it gets into those possible stereotyping and losing that curiosity you were mentioning earlier.
Exactly.
All right. So let's talk about then, you mentioned it already, that cultures can be viewed as high context or indirect, as you were mentioning, or low context direct culture. So definitely let the listeners know what the distinction is between that and what are some strategies for these environments.
Okay. So a low context culture, if you think of context meaning what's happening in the situation, a low context culture is a culture that says, I don't want you to have to interpret what I'm doing, why I'm doing it, or anything. I'm just going to tell it like it is. I'm going to be direct. I'm going to be to the point. I'm going to be straightforward. I'm just going to lay it out for you. So this may be hard to do, and this may totally fall apart without any visual, but if everybody could just kind of take their index left finger and point it up, all right, so it's pointing up in front of you, and if that's the point of the conversation, now you take your pointer finger on your right and you touch it to the left. Just touch it to the left. So I'm going to be on point. That's what we call being on point. I am going to deal with it directly. I'm going to touch that finger. I'm going to touch that point. I'm going to make it directly. You will not need to get anything from the situation or the context. It's low context. High context, if you take that same left pointer finger, your index finger, and you point it straight up, and then you take your right finger, and instead of touching it to the left finger, you circle it around it. Go round, over the top, around and around and around the finger. That is saying, I'm not going to touch on that point directly. I'm going to hint at things. I'm going to tell stories about things, and I'm hoping that you will intuit from the context of our conversation what it is that I need you to know. So the example that I always give is that if I say to my son, Christopher, boy, the trash can is getting really full. I am hoping from that context that he is going to take out the trash. But, miracle of miracles, he may not. And the next day I say, Chris, the trash can is really getting full. And he'll say, it really is. And I'll say, Chris, how come you didn't take it out? And he says, because you didn't tell me to. And this is what I call conveniently low context. He so knows what the context is. He so knows that I'm trying to be indirect, that I'm hoping that he will do it without me having to boss him around and tell him. but he's conveniently pretending, no. And we joke about it all the time. But it can create miscommunication because people who are low context want to be direct, and high context people think that that's rude, and it's aggressive, and it's domineering. And especially if they come from harmony-seeking collective cultures where the relationship is key, they are wanting to do much more of this circular high context. You're going to intuit it so that I am not in your face, so that I'm not having you lose face, so that you will understand what I need from you without me being so direct. But it is problematic, each one to the other, because the direct people oftentimes feel that an indirect person is not being transparent, therefore they must be lying. And the high context person sees the directness of the low context person is being very aggressive and almost assaultive. And so part of this is understanding the difference. Part of it is saying, I cannot, again, assume, going back to the assumptions, I cannot assume that because someone is not telling me something directly that they, aren't trying to tell me something in another way. I need to listen better. And I always say when you're dealing with someone who's high context, to try to go get close-ended questions and answers. Are you going to do this? Well, okay. A high-context person is usually not going to say no directly. That's too direct. They'll say that would be difficult, that would be hard, I may need to talk to someone about it, I'm not sure. And a low-context person may hear that and go, oh, they need to go talk to someone about it. But it also may be another way of saying, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm just not going to tell you directly I'm not going to do it because I don't want us to lose space together, and I want to maintain harmony for you and with you. So it's probably one of the toughest ones for people who are really, really direct. In Western cultures, especially in the United States, there is obviously a continuum, but we tend to be one of the more direct cultures. Let's get to the business. Let's get to the facts. Let me tell you how it is. And we kind of assume that as soon as people trust us and we build rapport with them, that we can be direct and they should be direct. And if they're not telling the truth. And those are huge, huge mistakes to make. Huge mistakes to make.
So in dealing with these types of, and I was sharing with Craig Rundy in our earlier episode on Culture and Conflict about our Russian friends, who are very, very indirect high context.
Yes.
And us being more low context, and so it's maneuvering, it's understanding that that's what's happening, that there's no ill intent for the person who is high context indirect as you described it. And so it's not that it's not saying that they're lying, but it's really trying to understand that that's how they communicate and engage with people. And I know that there's a continuum in the Western culture, but I think it's really much more prevalent if you were putting Western culture and Eastern culture on a continuum, that Eastern culture to some degree would probably be considered high context, I would imagine.
Yes, although there's huge variation in the Eastern culture. So what would be in India is different than China, which is different than Japan. And then again, within the regions of those cultures, it's different. But in general, Eastern cultures tend to be more high context and Western cultures tend to be more low context and more direct. Yeah.
So what advice would you give to someone like myself who has friends in another country, whatever that might be the typical high context and direct? So what are some strategies around dealing with that? Because that's where definitely miscommunication or misunderstanding or hurt feelings can come about. So how do we kind of narrow that gap a little bit?
I think part of it is patience. This is also hard for Westerners because we want to have our conversations be expedient and get to the point and realize that they may not. And so part of it is just settling into that different way of speaking. Another is not trying to reframe, which means to summarize too directly what it is that they have said. So if someone is saying, well, I'm not sure and I have to think about it and, I don't know, what are your thoughts? And then we go, well, you mean no? You mean no? Is that what you're trying to tell me is no? Then actually trying to reframe all the wonderful language that they're using to try to preserve the relationship into a no is actually probably one of the worst things to do. So to me it would be more saying something like, so talk to me a little bit more about what some of these difficulties might be. Now notice I'm not making it what are your difficulties or what do you want. I'm saying it's almost like a third-person discussion sometimes. So what have other people done in this situation that you've seen work or not work? And not personalize it as much, which is, again, is sometimes hard for Westerners because we like to get to the point and, that's the person that's accountable, and so we want to own the conversation with them. But sometimes, whether it's through a story or, this happened to my neighbor the other day. What do you think about this? Oh, well, blah, 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 blah. And then you might get a whole bunch more information than you would have. Well, what do you think happened to this situation? What do you think, you want or you need? So part of it is backing away from trying to have the person across from you make a direct statement. And I find gradually, if you take that finger again and the right finger going around and around the left finger, if it gradually gets going in closer and closer and closer to the point, then you might get there. If it starts way out and then you leap to the midpoint and leap to the point, you'll lose them. So it's gradually coming in, slowly coming in. And here's the thing. People say, well, I don't have time for this, or why should I adapt? And I'll go, you know what? The high context people adapt to low context all the time. And we just talked about a technique that a low context person could do. But high context people are learning techniques too about, okay, how do I understand that a person who's being direct with me is not intending to insult me? They're just trying to get to the point, and it's very different than how I behave. And I work with a lot of people in Eastern countries where I talk to them about this, where people say, well, you Americans are so rude. And I'll say, I can understand how that impression might come because we tend to be very direct. Well, yes, and directness is very rude. And say, well, sometimes directness can be rude, but sometimes that's not the intention at all. Sometimes it's a sense of clarity, a sense of trying to get to the point. And so we need to separate people who are intentionally being rude to you, in which you respond to them maybe one way, and someone who you might feel is being rude to you, but that's not their intention. Again, we always make these attribution errors. The reason they're being so direct is because they're rude. The reason that they're not telling me directly is because they're lying. Because we're saying, well, if I wasn't being direct, if I was kind of skirting the issue, that would probably mean I was trying to avoid it. Or if, so in each of those situations, it goes back to stepping back, always stepping back and trying to figure out intention and rather than assuming.
I love that because it does tie back to those, as you said earlier, those inappropriate assumptions that, or false assumptions that we tend to make. And the other phrase that you use that some listeners might not have ever heard before is the attribution error. We attribute, as you said. So we are starting to wrap down, and I do really want to get to the last question, which was something very interesting, which is this common mistake that you say people tend to do, and I think their intention is to understand, but they pretend to be in someone else's shoes to understand their feelings or experience. So why is this a common mistake?
Well, it's interesting because it's such a common piece of advice that everybody gives. Just pretend you're in their shoes, and then it'll work out. And I'll go, no. You will never be them in their shoes. You will be you standing in their shoes. And the shoes may be too big or too small or too wide or too narrow, but you will never be them in their shoes. And I realize I'm taking that and making it very literal, but the mistake I think that happens is if we think we can be in their shoes and make assumptions based on our own life and our own culture and our own gender about why they're doing something and what they're thinking and pretending if I was them, this is what I think they would be meaning. We're making all those assumptions and making that attribution error that we just referred to, saying if I was them, this is what, and this is the reason for what they would be doing. And we could be totally off base. So we're not curious. If we imagine who they are by being in their shoes, we don't ask the questions. We're not as curious. We make assumptions rather than saying, I will. It's like if someone says to me, what's the most empathetic thing you could ever say to someone if they're in high emotion? And I say, never say to somebody, I know exactly how you're feeling. Never say it. Because you don't, and you're not in their life, and it's their life and their culture and their grief or their conflict. If we say, I can't imagine how hard this would be for you, then you got them. Then you have empathy because they say, you know what? She is not trying to pretend she knows who I am. She is someone who's listening to me and who's curious rather than somebody who's saying, oh, yeah, I know exactly how you're feeling. So that goes back to the stepping in the other person's shoes. You can stand next to them and walk with them while they're in their shoes and you're in your shoes, but you can't get in their shoes. They're not going to fit. So I always think that that's a huge mistake when we tell people to do that.
I love that you said that and really made that distinction. And that part is that you will be you in their shoes in a place of curiosity and asking questions and not making those attribution errors, right? But before we go into our closing, because we always have an assignment for the week or a call to action, you have some really good ones. Is there anything more that you want to say about emotions or feelings or how we respond to those from a cultural context? Is there anything more you wanted to say about that?
I think in general for us to understand that cultures view grief and pain and sadness and death and conflict very, very differently, and some cultures are very, very external, is what I call it, external in their emotions. You will be able, it's loud, it's transparent, it's wailing, it's people upset, it's pounding on the table. And there are people who have just as much grief and just as much emotion and just as much pain, and yet they're very internal with their feelings, and they do not express them in a way that's very apparent. And sometimes people who are very expressive in their emotions are with someone who's not expressive with theirs, and they say, well, they must not be feeling very much pain, or, oh, look how easily they got over that, or I'm so glad that they've moved through that so well, or they can't be possibly as upset as I am about this because they seem so calm about it. But it doesn't have anything to do with the internal emotions that somebody has. Emotions are primal. How people exhibit those emotions are cultural and gender and individually based. And so just like every other thing we've talked about, we can't make assumptions based on people's outside behavior as to the emotional impact that something is having on them.
Very good. Thank you very much. This has been a wonderful program to really make some distinctions here about conflict and culture, and especially on all the different concepts that you've touched on, from fairness to this very important piece around uncertainty and avoidance, and these indirect and direct types of cultures. All of these things that you've talked about, and I know that you teach weeks or days on these courses and have years of experience. So this is just a tiny touchstone on that, and so thank you for coming on to share that. What is our call to action or assignment for the week for our listeners? We want them to take the next step to really raise their level of awareness, so what can they do to do that?
Well, I'll give them the same assignments that I give. I teach this as an academic class, 40 hours of this, and one of the things that I say to my students, or if I'm doing a training, because I train companies and corporations in it as well, and I give them the same assignment, which is, this is all fine and good, listening and going, oh, yeah, but you have to experience it. So my call is go to a place that you've never been before, go to an international market, or go to a religious ceremony, or do something that is in an area that you've never done before. And that may not be as a participant, it may just be as an observer. I am not suggesting that people go into dark alleys and say, okay, I've never been here before, this is an experience. I'm not talking about doing something that's unsafe. But I am saying push out of our comfort zones. We tend to listen to people that agree with us. That's called confirmation bias. We tend to hang out with people that are more like us because it's more comfortable. And I want people to stretch, and I want people to experience things differently, because the first is, what is my awareness? What is my awareness level of how people do things differently? And then second, to say, okay, what do I do with all of that? And then hopefully, there's 3 stages, and this is oftentimes used in psychological theory of conflict: awareness, knowledge, and skills. To truly have that awareness, it's not listening to me or somebody else, it's feeling it. And then say, okay, now I have some knowledge, so I know the difference between high and low context. I know the difference between high and low uncertainty avoidance. So what am I going to do about it? That'll only stay in your brain for so long. The listening part, you have to take it and do something with it. So hopefully find 1 or 2 practical things, maybe even just one practical thing from the last 45 minutes, and say, in the next 30 days, I'm going to practice that. I'm going to practice asking questions to figure out if someone has high uncertainty avoidance or distrust of me. Because we can't say to them, do you have high uncertainty avoidance or situational distrust? They're not going to know. We didn't know about it until we talked about it. So to pick a skill, So one is to go experience something you haven't experienced before in a different culture or a different faith or whatever is pushing your envelope a little bit. And the other is pick a skill from the last 45 minutes and say in the next 30 days, I'm going to take it from my sort of sensory memory to my working memory, which made me understand it, and make it go into my long-term memory, which means it will be a skill that I will retain once I practice it. So those are sort of the two-prong call.
Okay, very, very good. All right, so listeners, if you want to share your experience from this assignment for the week and hopefully beyond the week, we encourage you to certainly post on Nina's show page. There's ways to post comments there. You can certainly leave it on our Facebook page, Conflict Connections, but also reach out to Nina. And so how can they best find you, find information about you?
The best way is through my website, which is hosted by Mediate.com. So it's www.mediate.com. And then there's a / and then my name, all in lowercase with no space. So NINAMEIERDING. And I think that's probably somewhere on your page as well.
Yes.
And to contact me there is probably the best way. And then if you want to send an email directly to me, there's a little, it says contact me, and then you can go ahead and do that. Or you can go ahead and contact me directly through my email, which is nina@meierding.com.
Okay, wonderful, great. So Nina, we're coming to a close. What final message do you want to leave with listeners tonight?
I would say, when people ask me who is best at resolving conflicts, whether it's a mediator or a boss or a neighbor, I'll say people who are curious, people who have empathy, people who don't make too many assumptions, and people who are willing to look at a problem from many different perspectives, whether that's culture, gender, or individuals. So my hope is that this last 45 minutes has really been not just about raising an awareness level, but also about some really practical things that we can incorporate in our lives together that help us become better citizens of the world.
Wonderful. I thank you from the bottom of our heart and my heart and on behalf of the listeners for being here, sharing your expertise. It was so genuine and organic in our conversation today. This is extremely valuable information, and thank you again for being part of our program series.
You're very, very welcome, and it was an honor to be here.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Thank you for listening to the Texas Conflict Coach. We hope you've enjoyed the program. You can find over 300 podcasts archived to listen at your own convenience at texasconflictcoach.com or download the podcast at iTunes or Stitcher Radio. To learn about upcoming radio programs and resources, sign up for our monthly e-newsletter.